Maxwell Cole's charity event at Sunshine Orphanage was supposed to be just another corporate obligation, another tax write-off for his tech empire worth $200 million. But when he saw 6-year-old Emily Reyes sitting alone in the corner, wearing a delicate silver necklace with a ruby pendant that stopped his heart cold, everything changed. That necklace had been buried with his daughter 3 years ago. Or so he thought. How was this little girl wearing the one piece of jewelry that connected him to his greatest loss? The answer would shatter everything he believed about his past and give him the family he never knew he still had. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The November rain drummed against the tall windows of Sunshine Orphanage as Maxwell Cole straightened his tie and checked his Rolex. 3:30 in the afternoon, and he had already mentally calculated how much this appearance was costing him in lost productivity. His assistant had scheduled this charity visit months ago, back when his public relations team insisted he needed more community engagement to soften his image as the ruthless CEO of Cole Technologies. The optics were perfect, they said. A successful businessman giving back to disadvantaged children would play well in the business journals and tech magazines that followed his every move. Maxwell had built his empire from nothing, transforming a small software startup into a global technology powerhouse that employed over 15,000 people worldwide. At 42, he was worth more than most small countries' GDP, owned properties on 3 continents, and commanded respect in boardrooms from Silicon Valley to Tokyo. Yet standing in the modest lobby of this children's home, surrounded by crayon drawings and construction paper crafts, he felt oddly out of place in his $1,500 suit. Sister Margaret, the orphanage director, approached with the kind of warm smile that made Maxwell immediately suspicious. In his experience, people only smiled at him that broadly when they wanted something expensive. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her simple dress spoke of someone who understood the value of every donated dollar. She extended a weathered hand that had clearly seen decades of caring for children who had nowhere else to go. "Mr. Cole, we're so honored to have you here today. The children have been so excited to meet you," she said, her voice carrying the slight Irish accent that suggested she had been with the orphanage for many years. "We've prepared a small presentation about our programs, and then we thought you might like to meet some of our residents personally." Maxwell nodded politely, his mind already racing through the calculations of how quickly he could fulfill his obligations and return to the office. His calendar was packed with meetings about the upcoming product launch that could revolutionize mobile computing, and every minute spent here was a minute lost in staying ahead of competitors who would love nothing more than to see Cole Technologies stumble. He had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let sentiment interfere with business. The presentation began in a small conference room, decorated with children's artwork and photographs of successful adoptions over the years. Sister Margaret spoke passionately about their mission, their success rates, and their desperate need for funding to expand their programs. Maxwell found himself genuinely impressed despite his cynicism. The numbers were solid, the overhead was minimal, and the outcomes were measurably positive. These people were running a tight operation with limited resources, something he could respect as a businessman. "We currently house 63 children ranging in age from 6 months to 17 years, Sister Margaret explained, clicking through slides on an aging projector that probably dated back to the 1990s. "Our adoption rate has improved significantly over the past 5 years, but we still have many children who have been with us for extended periods. Some have medical needs that make placement challenging, others have behavioral issues stemming from trauma, and some are simply older children who statistically have lower adoption rates." End quote. Maxwell listened with the same analytical attention he brought to quarterly reports and market analyses. The challenges were clear, the solutions required capital, and the return on investment was measured in human lives rather than profit margins. It was the kind of problem that appealed to his systematic mind, even if the emotional component made him uncomfortable. He had learned long ago to compartmentalize feelings, to focus on actionable data, rather than getting lost in sentiment that served no practical purpose. After the presentation, Sister Margaret led him through the facility's common areas. The orphanage was clean, but clearly operating on a shoestring budget. The furniture was mismatched donations, the toys were well used, but carefully maintained, and the walls bore that institutional paint color that suggested frequent repainting with whatever was cheapest. Despite the obvious financial constraints, there was a warmth to the place that money couldn't buy, a sense of genuine care that emanated from every staff member they encountered. In the main recreation room, about 20 children were engaged in various activities under the supervision of volunteers and staff members. Some were working on homework at round tables, others were playing board games, and a few were quietly reading in a corner designated as the library. Maxwell observed them with the same detached interest he might show when touring a new manufacturing facility, noting the efficient use of space and the organizational systems that kept everything running smoothly. That's when he saw her. Emily Reyes sat alone at a small table near the window, carefully coloring in a book with the intense concentration that only children brought to tasks adults considered simple. Her dark hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and she wore a simple pink dress that looked like it had been donated but was clean and well-fitted. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, small for her age, but with an alertness in her posture that suggested intelligence beyond her years. But it wasn't her appearance that stopped Maxwell in his tracks and sent ice through his veins. It was the necklace she wore, a delicate silver chain with a ruby pendant shaped like a tiny rose. The same necklace he had placed around his daughter Sarah's neck on her 5th birthday, 3 months before the accident that took her life. The same necklace that had been buried with her in Evergreen Cemetery, in a coffin he had personally selected, and a grave he visited every year on the anniversary of the worst day of his life. Maxwell's hand instinctively went to his chest, where his heart had begun hammering with a force that made him dizzy. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and he gripped the back of a nearby chair to steady himself. Sister Margaret was still talking about the children's daily routines and educational programs, but her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. Every detail of that necklace was burned into his memory with perfect clarity, from the tiny imperfection in the ruby's cut to the distinctive way the rose petals were etched into the stone. He had commissioned that piece specifically for Sarah, from a jewelry designer in New York who specialized in one of Viking children's accessories. The ruby had been chosen because red was Sarah's favorite color, and the rose design reflected her love of the garden they had tended together behind their house in the hills overlooking the city. The pendant was unique, irreplaceable, and according to every belief Maxwell held about death and burial, impossible for this child to be wearing. "Sister Margaret," Maxwell interrupted, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "That little girl by the window, can you tell me about her?" The nun followed his gaze to Emily and smiled with obvious affection. "Oh, that's Emily Reyes. She's been with us for about 8 months now. Sweet child, very bright, but she's had some challenges. She doesn't speak much. And she's quite attached to that necklace. We've never been able to get the full story about where it came from, but it was the only personal possession she had when she arrived." Maxwell's mouth went dry. 8 months ago would have been around the time his ex-wife Vivian had moved to Europe with her new husband, claiming she needed to escape the memories that haunted her everywhere in the city where Sarah had lived and died. They had barely spoken since the divorce was finalized 2 years earlier, their relationship destroyed by grief that neither of them had known how to process together. Losing a child had torn them apart rather than bringing them closer, each dealing with the trauma in ways that made the other's pain more difficult to bear. "What do you know about her background?" Maxwell asked, trying to keep his voice level despite the earthquake happening in his chest. His business instincts were kicking in, the same systematic approach he used to analyze acquisitions and market opportunities, but this felt infinitely more important than any deal he had ever negotiated. Sister Margaret glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard, then lowered her voice. "She was brought to us through the state system after being found in an apartment with a woman who claimed to be her aunt. The situation was quite irregular, and there were some legal complications that I'm not entirely privy to. The woman couldn't provide proper documentation of guardianship, and Emily herself was unable or unwilling to provide much information about her previous living situation." Maxwell felt something cold and methodical clicking into place in his mind. The same analytical process that had made him successful in business now focused entirely on this impossible situation. "Do you have any documentation about her placement here? Birth certificate, medical records, Anything that might indicate her family history? I'm afraid that information is confidential and would need to come through proper legal channels. Sister Margaret replied, but her tone suggested she understood this was more than casual curiosity. However, if you're interested in learning more about Emily specifically, I could arrange for you to speak with our SEPU social worker. There might be ways to access appropriate information if you have legitimate reasons for asking. Maxwell nodded, his mind already racing ahead to the phone calls he would need to make and the private investigators he could hire to dig deeper into this mystery. But first, he needed to approach the child herself. To see the necklace up close and confirm what his eyes were telling him was impossible. He moved across the room with the careful deliberation of someone trying not to spook a wild animal, aware that his presence might seem intimidating to a 6-year-old who had no reason to trust adults in expensive suits. Emily looked up as he approached, her large brown eyes meeting his with a directness that was unusual for such a young child. Most kids her age were shy around strangers, especially imposing figures like Maxwell. But she regarded him with a calm assessment that reminded him painfully of Sarah's habit of studying people before deciding whether they were worth her attention. The resemblance was subtle, but unmistakable now that he was Carmen. Looking for it. Something in the shape of her face and the intelligent way she held herself. "Hello," Maxwell said, lowering himself into the small chair across from her with as much dignity as his tall frame would allow. "I'm Maxwell. What are you working on there?" Emily studied him for a long moment before pointing to her coloring book, which featured intricate princess designs that she was filling in with meticulous attention to staying within the lines. Her technique was advanced for her age, showing the kind of patience and precision that suggested she had spent considerable time practicing. The crayons were arranged in neat rows beside her workspace, organized by color in a way that spoke to an orderly Burrell mind. "That's beautiful work," Maxwell said, meaning it. "You're very talented. That necklace you're wearing is quite pretty too. Can you tell me where you got it?" Emily's hand went instinctively to the pendant, her fingers closing around it in a protective gesture that made Maxwell's heart clench. She shook her head without speaking, but her expression became guarded in a way that suggested the necklace was connected to memories she either couldn't or wouldn't share. The protective gesture was heartbreakingly familiar. Exactly the way Sarah used to touch her special treasures when she felt they might be taken away. Maxwell spent another few minutes trying to engage her in conversation, asking about her favorite colors, her drawings, and her life at the orphanage. Emily responded with nods, shakes of her head, and the occasional single word, but she never removed her hand from the necklace. Her reticence wasn't unusual for a child who had experienced trauma, but Maxwell sensed there was more to her silence than simple shyness. She was protecting something, guarding secrets that were too big for someone her age to carry alone. When it became clear that Emily wasn't going to open Grail up to a stranger, no matter how gentle his approach, Maxwell excused himself and found Sister Margaret again. His mind was churning with possibilities and questions that needed immediate answers, but he forced himself to maintain the composed exterior that had served him well in countless business negotiations. The key was to gather information systematically before making any moves that might complicate the Barai situation. "Sister Margaret, I'd like to make a donation to the orphanage," Maxwell said, pulling out his checkbook with the smooth efficiency of someone accustomed to solving problems with money. "Let's say $500,000 to start, with the possibility of additional support depending on your needs." The nun's eyes widened, and Maxwell could see her mentally calculating how far that money would stretch in terms of improvements, programs, and care for the children. It was more than their annual operating budget, the kind of gift that could transform the entire facility and expand their ability to help vulnerable children throughout the region. He had chosen the amount carefully, large enough to ensure cooperation, but not so large as to seem suspicious or create unwanted attention. "That's incredibly generous, Mr. Cole." "I don't know what to say," Sister Margaret replied, her voice thick with emotion. "This will make such a difference for our children." "Is there anything specific you'd like the funds to support?" "I'd like to help with Emily's situation specifically," Maxwell said, maintaining the careful balance between interest and pushiness that he had learned in business negotiations. "I'd like to explore the possibility of adoption. which means I'll need access to whatever information you have about her background and legal status. I understand there are protocols to follow, and I'm prepared to work through the proper channels." Sister Margaret's expression shifted to something more cautious, the practiced wariness of someone who had seen too many well-meaning adults who didn't understand the complexities of child welfare. "Adoption is a serious process, Mr. Cole, and Emily's situation is particularly complicated. There are legal issues that haven't been fully resolved, and any potential adoptive family would need to undergo extensive screening and preparation. It's not something that can be rushed, regardless of financial resources." Maxwell nodded, appreciating her professionalism even as frustration bubbled beneath his composed surface. In business, problems could usually be solved quickly, with the right combination of money, connections, and determination. But this was different, involving legal systems and bureaucracies that moved at their own pace regardless of how urgently he wanted answers. The necklace around Emily's neck represented a mystery that went to the core of his deepest loss. And every minute of delay felt like another minute of potential truth slipping away. "I understand completely," Maxwell replied, though understanding and accepting were two different things. "I'd like to begin the process immediately. Can you put me in touch with the appropriate social worker and legal representatives? I'm prepared to provide whatever documentation, references, and background checks are required." Over the next 2 hours, Maxwell found himself navigating a maze of bureaucracy that made corporate regulatory compliance seem simple by comparison. The orphanage's social worker, Mrs. Rodriguez, was a thorough professional who explained the adoption process with the patience of someone who had guided many hopeful parents through the system. Home studies, background checks, psychological evaluations, financial assessments, and mandatory training courses were just the beginning of a process that typically took 6 to 12 months under ideal circumstances. Emily's case was far from ideal. Her legal status was complicated by the irregular circumstances of her placement and the ongoing investigation into her previous living situation. The woman who had claimed to be her aunt had disappeared after Emily was removed from her care, leaving behind a trail of inconsistencies and unanswered questions that the authorities were still trying to unravel. Until those issues were resolved, Emily remained a ward of the state, with an uncertain future. Maxwell left the orphanage that evening with a thick folder of paperwork and a business card for the private investigator Mrs. Rodriguez discreetly recommended for cases involving family history research. His mind was already working through the logistics of accelerating the adoption process while simultaneously investigating the mystery of the necklace. He had built his business empire by refusing to accept limitations that others took for granted, and he wasn't about to start accepting them now when something this important was at stake. The drive back to his penthouse apartment gave him time to process what had happened and begin formulating a plan of action. The city lights blurred past his windows as his driver navigated the evening traffic, but Maxwell saw none of it. His thoughts were entirely focused on a 6-year-old girl wearing his dead daughter's necklace and the implications of that impossible fact. Every rational explanation he could construct crumbled under the weight of what he had seen with his own eyes. That night, Maxwell sat in his home office surrounded by the tools of his success, multiple computer monitors displaying stock prices and business intelligence reports. But his attention was focused on a small photograph he kept in his desk drawer. Sarah, at age 5, wearing the ruby rose necklace on her birthday, her smile bright with the joy of a child who believed the world was full of wonderful possibilities. The image was almost painful to look at, but tonight he studied every detail, comparing his memories of Sarah with his observations of Emily. The resemblance wasn't immediately obvious, the kind of subtle family similarity that might go unnoticed, unless you were specifically looking for it. But the bone structure of their faces was similar, the way they both held their heads when considering something carefully, and most tellingly, their identical habit of touching precious objects when they felt protective or uncertain. These were the kinds of genetic echoes that couldn't be faked or coincidental, the deep patterns that persisted across generations, regardless of environment or upbringing. Maxwell opened his laptop and began researching private investigation services that specialized in family history and genealogy cases. Money was no object, and he needed the best available expertise to unravel whatever had happened during the chaotic period following Sarah's death and his divorce from Vivian. Those months were largely a blur in his memory, a haze of grief and legal proceedings that he had deliberately tried to forget. Now he needed to reconstruct that timeline with perfect accuracy, to understand how Emily could exist and why she had been hidden from him. The private investigator he hired, Marcus Chen, came with impeccable credentials and a reputation for discretion that had earned him clients among the city's most prominent families. When Maxwell met with him the following morning, he laid out the situation with the same systematic precision he brought to business presentations. The facts were straightforward, the implications were staggering, and he needed answers with a speed that reflected the urgency he felt every time he thought about Emily sitting alone in that orphanage. "I need you to investigate my ex-wife's activities during the 6 months following our daughter's death," Maxwell explained, sliding a check across the conference table that represented more money than most people earned in a year. "I also need a complete background investigation on Emily Reyes, including DNA analysis if possible, and a trace on the woman who claimed to be her aunt. I want to know everything about how Emily ended up at Sunshine Orphanage and why she's wearing a necklace that should be buried in Evergreen Cemetery." Marcus Chen was a thin man in his 50s whose unremarkable appearance concealed a razor-sharp intellect and investigative skills that had made him wealthy by solving problems for people who could afford the best. He reviewed Maxwell's file with the methodical attention of someone who understood that details mattered more than dramatic theories, asking the kind of probing questions that demonstrated both competence and discretion. "DNA analysis will require either cooperation from the child or legal authorization," Chen noted, making careful notes in his leather portfolio. "Given the adoption proceedings you've initiated, we might be able to work through the appropriate channels, but it will take time. In the meantime, I can focus on your ex-wife's activities and the circumstances surrounding Emily's placement. How much do you remember about Vivian's behavior during the period after your daughter's death?" Maxwell closed his eyes and tried to access memories he had spent years trying to suppress. The weeks following Sarah's funeral had been a nightmare of grief, anger, and mutual blame that had destroyed his marriage as thoroughly as the accident had destroyed his daughter. Vivian had blamed him for working too much, for not being there to prevent the accident, while he had blamed her for not watching Sarah closely enough during the family outing that had turned tragic. Neither accusation was fair or accurate, but grief had made them both cruel in ways they had never imagined possible. Vivian disappeared for several weeks about 2 months after the funeral, Maxwell recalled, the memories coming back with painful clarity. "She said she needed space to process her grief, but she wouldn't tell me where she was going or when she'd be back. When she returned, she was different, more withdrawn, and secretive. She started talking about moving away, starting fresh somewhere that wasn't full of memories. I assumed it was just part of her grieving process." Chen nodded, adding notes to his growing file. "Did she have family or close friends who might have helped her during that period? Anyone who might have known about a pregnancy or been involved in hiding a child?" The question hit Maxwell like a physical blow, forcing him to confront possibilities he had been avoiding since seeing Emily the previous day. If the child was his daughter, if Vivian had somehow been pregnant when Sarah died and had hidden that fact from him, then the betrayal went deeper than he had imagined. But the timeline made sense in a horrible way, explaining Vivian's erratic behavior and her desperate need to escape their shared life in the city where Sarah had lived and died. Her sister Maria lived in Los Angeles, and they were very close, Maxwell said slowly, working through implications that made his chest tight with a mixture of hope and rage. "Maria was always protective of Vivian, and she never liked me much. If Vivian was hiding something, Maria would have helped her do it." Over the following days, Maxwell threw himself into the adoption process with the same intensity he brought to major business acquisitions. He attended mandatory parenting classes, submitted to psychological evaluations, and opened his financial records to government scrutiny with a transparency that his competitors would have found shocking. Every requirement was met with military precision, every form filed immediately upon receipt, every appointment scheduled at the earliest possible time. Meanwhile, Chen's investigation began producing results that confirmed Maxwell's worst fears and greatest hopes simultaneously. Vivian had indeed spent several weeks in Los Angeles during the period in question, staying with her sister Maria in circumstances that suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous grief response. Medical records, obtained through channels Chen preferred not to discuss, indicated that Vivian had given birth to a daughter approximately 7 months after Sarah's death. The baby had been placed with a woman named Carmen Reyes, who had connections to Maria through Los Angeles's informal network of childcare providers and domestic workers. Carmen had been presented as a reliable caregiver who could provide a stable home for a child whose mother was unable to care for her due to ongoing grief and mental health issues. The arrangement had been intended as temporary, but Vivian's departure for Europe had made it permanent by default. Carmen Reyes had died unexpectedly 6 months earlier, leaving Emily in the care of a woman who claimed to be Carmen's sister, but whose relationship to the family was increasingly unclear as the investigation progressed. When authorities discovered irregularities in Emily's placement, including forged guardianship documents and inconsistent identity information, the child had been removed and placed in the state system for her own protection. The DNA results, obtained through samples collected during Emily's routine medical care at the orphanage, confirmed what Maxwell's heart had known from the moment he saw the necklace. Emily Reyes was his biological daughter, hidden from him for more than 6 years by an ex-wife who had chosen to let him believe his only child was dead, rather than fight for custody in their bitter divorce proceedings. The betrayal was comprehensive and devastating, but it was also the answer to prayers he hadn't realized he was still praying. Armed with genetic proof and a growing file of evidence about Emily's true parentage, Maxwell's legal team moved to expedite the adoption process, while simultaneously filing charges against Vivian for child abandonment, fraud, and violation of custody agreements that had never existed because he had never known Emily existed. The legal machinery ground forward with increasing momentum, but Maxwell's focus remained on the little girl who represented both the greatest gift and the greatest injustice he had ever encountered. He began visiting Emily at the orphanage daily, working carefully to build a relationship without overwhelming her with the intensity of his emotions. She remained largely silent during their interactions, but he sensed a gradual warming in her attitude toward him. She would smile slightly when he arrived, and she had begun showing him her drawings and coloring projects with shy pride. The necklace remained constantly around her neck, and Maxwell had decided not to mention its significance until their relationship was more established. Sister Margaret watched these interactions with the experienced eye of someone who had seen many potential adoptions succeed and fail based on the chemistry between adult and child. She confided to Maxwell that Emily seemed more animated and responsive during his visits than she had been at any point during her residency at the orphanage, suggesting that whatever connection existed between them was crass, mutual, and genuine. "She asks about you when you're not here," Sister Margaret mentioned one afternoon as Maxwell prepared to leave after spending 2 hours reading stories and working on puzzles with Emily. "She doesn't say much, but she watches the door and perks up when she hears cars in the parking lot. That's the most engaged I've seen her with any adult since she arrived." Maxwell felt a warmth in his chest that had been absent since Sarah's death, a sense of purpose and connection that his business success had never provided. Building a relationship with Emily required patience and sensitivity that were foreign to his usual approach to problems, but the rewards were infinitely more meaningful than any corporate achievement. Every small smile, every moment of trust, every indication that she was beginning to see him as a safe person was worth more than all the money in his various bank accounts. The legal process reached its conclusion on a gray December morning, exactly 3 months after Maxwell's first visit to Sunshine Orphanage. The courtroom was nearly empty except for the necessary officials, Maxwell's legal team, and Sister Margaret, who had come to provide moral support for both Maxwell and Emily during the formal adoption proceedings. Emily sat beside Maxwell in a new dress he had bought for the occasion, her small hand gripping his with surprising strength as the judge reviewed the extensive documentation that had accumulated during the investigation and approval process. Judge Patricia Williams was a veteran of family court who had overseen thousands of adoption cases during her career, but even she seemed moved by the unusual circumstances that had brought this family together. The genetic evidence was undisputable. The background investigations had confirmed Maxwell's suitability as a parent, and the child's best interests clearly lay with her biological father, who had the resources and desire to provide excellent care. Mr. Cole, adoption is a permanent legal relationship that carries all the rights and responsibilities of biological parenthood, Judge Williams said, her voice formal but kind. Are you prepared to accept full responsibility for Emily's physical, emotional, and financial well-being from this day forward? I am, Your Honor, Maxwell replied, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Emily is my daughter, and I want nothing more than to give her the loving home she deserves. The judge turned her attention to Emily, lowering her voice to the gentle tone she reserved for the youngest participants in her courtroom. Emily, do you understand that Mr. Cole wants to be your daddy and take you home to live with him? Do you want to go live with him and be part of his family? Emily looked up at Maxwell with those serious brown eyes that reminded him so much of Sarah, then nodded solemnly. Yes, she whispered, the first word she had spoken in the courtroom, and one of the few words Maxwell had heard her say during their months of visits. The gavel came down with finality that resonated through Maxwell's entire being. Emily Cole was officially his daughter, legally and permanently, with all the documentation required to prove their relationship to schools, doctors, and anyone else who might need verification. The little girl who had been hidden from him for more than 6 years was finally coming home where she belonged, and the necklace she wore was no longer a mystery, but a bridge between his lost daughter and his found daughter. The drive to Maxwell's penthouse apartment was quiet but comfortable. Emily pressed against the window watching the city pass by, while Maxwell pointed out landmarks and places they would visit together. His home had been hastily child-proofed by a team of professionals who had transformed guest bedrooms into a little girl's paradise, complete with toys, books, art supplies, and furniture scaled to someone Emily's size. The decorating had been done by experts, but Maxwell had personally selected items he thought she would enjoy, based on his observations of her preferences during their visits. Emily's reaction to her new home was typically restrained, but Maxwell caught glimpses of wonder in her expressions as she explored rooms that were larger than the entire orphanage facility. The playroom with its wall of windows overlooking the city, the library stocked with children's books from around the world, the art studio where she could draw and paint to her heart's content, all seemed to overwhelm her with possibilities she was still trying to process. That first evening, as Maxwell tucked her into the canopy bed that dominated her new bedroom, Emily finally spoke about the necklace that had brought them together. Her small fingers traced the ruby rose pendant as she looked up at him with an expression more serious than any 6-year-old should have to wear. The lady said it was from my real daddy, Emily whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. She said someday he would find me, and I would know him, because he would recognize what was his. She said to never take it off, no matter what happened, because it was the only way he could find me. Maxwell felt tears threatening for the first time since Sarah's funeral, as he realized that Carmen Reyes, the woman who had cared for Emily for most of her young life, had somehow understood the significance of the necklace, and had preserved it specifically so that Maxwell could eventually find his daughter. The silver chain that had been meant to rest forever with Sarah had instead become the beacon that guided him to Emily, completing a circle that connected his grief to his healing in ways he was still struggling to understand. She was right, Maxwell said softly, leaning down to kiss Emily's forehead. I've been looking for you for a very long time, and the necklace helped me find you. You're safe now, and you're home, and you never have to worry about being alone again. Emily smiled then, the first full smile he had seen from her, and Maxwell understood that they were both beginning a journey of healing that would take time, but would ultimately restore what had been broken in both their lives. The little girl wearing his late daughter's necklace had turned out to be his own daughter, alive and real, and finally where she belonged. The corporate empire that had consumed his life for so many years suddenly seemed less important than reading bedtime stories and learning what made a 6-year-old laugh. As Maxwell prepared for bed that night in his own room down the hall from Emily's, he thought about the chain of events that had brought them together. A routine charity visit had become the most important day of his life, proof that sometimes the universe conspired to heal wounds that seemed permanent and restore families that seemed forever broken. The necklace that had represented his greatest loss had become the key to his greatest gain, and the daughter he had never known existed was sleeping safely under his roof, where she would grow up surrounded by love and security. The next morning brought new challenges, as Maxwell adjusted his entire life around the needs of a 6-year-old, who was still processing the enormous changes in her circumstances. Business meetings were rescheduled around school enrollment and pediatric appointments. Conference calls were interrupted by requests for juice boxes and help with coloring projects. The corporate titan who had ruled boardrooms with iron discipline found himself completely reorganizing his priorities around someone who measured less than 4 feet tall and communicated primarily through nods and shy smiles. Emily's adjustment to her new life was gradual but steady. The luxurious apartment that could have been intimidating became a playground where she discovered new interests and talents every day. The art studio became her favorite retreat, where she created elaborate drawings that showed increasing complexity and confidence as weeks passed. Maxwell had professional art supplies brought in and hired a children's art instructor who came twice a week to nurture Emily's obvious creative talents. School enrollment required extensive documentation and careful consideration of Emily's unique needs as a child who had experienced significant trauma and disruption. Maxwell chose a small private academy known for individualized attention and therapeutic support, where Emily could receive both excellent academic instruction and the emotional support she needed to overcome her difficult early years. The transition was challenging initially, but Emily's intelligence and resilience helped her adapt more quickly than anyone had expected. The most remarkable change was in Emily's willingness to communicate. The silent little girl, who had rarely spoken above a whisper, began opening up as her sense of security grew stronger. She asked questions about everything from how elevators worked to why the sky changed colors at sunset. Maxwell found himself learning to explain complex concepts in terms a 6-year-old could understand, a skill that proved surprisingly useful in business presentations, where simplifying complexity was essential for effective communication. One evening, about 2 months after the adoption was finalized, Emily surprised Maxwell by asking about Sarah while they worked together on a jigsaw puzzle depicting a garden full of roses. She had never mentioned the necklace's history or shown curiosity about its origins, but tonight she seemed ready to understand the connection between her present and Maxwell's past. "Daddy, who was the other little girl who had my necklace?" Emily asked, her small fingers manipulating puzzle pieces with increasing skill. "Was she your little girl too?" Maxwell felt his chest tighten with familiar grief, but this time the pain was tempered by gratitude for the opportunity to share Sarah's memory with someone who would help keep it alive. He had wondered how to approach this conversation, but Emily's direct question provided the opening he needed to begin building bridges between his past loss and his present joy. "Her name was Sarah, and she was my daughter before I knew about you," Maxwell explained, choosing his words carefully to be honest without overwhelming her with concepts she wasn't ready to understand. "She died when she was 5 years old, before you were born. And I gave her that necklace for her birthday because red was her favorite color and she loved roses. When she died, I thought I would never have another little girl to love, but I was wrong. The necklace found its way to you, and you found your way to me." Emily considered this information with the serious expression she wore when processing something important, her head tilted slightly in a gesture that reminded Maxwell painfully of Sarah's thinking pose. The resemblance between his daughters was subtle but undeniable. Genetic echoes that connected them across the tragedy that had separated their father from both of them for far too long. "Is she in heaven now?" Emily asked, demonstrating the direct approach to difficult topics that children often managed better than adults who had learned to avoid uncomfortable truths. "I believe she is," Maxwell replied, meaning it more than he had since the accident that had taken Sarah from him. "And I think she would be very happy to know that her necklace helped me find her little sister." Emily smiled at the idea of having a sister, even one she would never meet, and Maxwell realized that he had found a way to honor Sarah's memory while building a future with Emily that wasn't defined entirely by loss and grief. The necklace would always connect his daughters, but now it represented continuity and love, rather than just sorrow and regret. As spring arrived and Emily became more comfortable in her new life, Maxwell began planning ways to expand their family experiences beyond the confines of his penthouse apartment. Weekend trips to museums and parks, visits to the zoo and aquarium, and exploration of the city's many family-friendly attractions became regular parts of their routine. Emily's world grew larger and more colorful as her confidence increased and her trust in Maxwell's permanence in her life became unshakable. The transformation in both their lives was remarkable to observe from the outside. Maxwell's business associates noticed that his legendary intensity had been tempered by something that made him more approachable and thoughtful in his decision-making. Board meetings that once ran late into the evening were now scheduled to end by 5 o'clock so he could be home for dinner with Emily. Business trips were planned around school schedules and shortened to minimize time away from his daughter, who had become the center of his universe in ways that surprised everyone who knew him. Emily flourished under the stability and attention that had been missing from her early years. Her teachers reported remarkable progress in both academic and social development, noting that she was beginning to participate more actively in classroom discussions and forming friendships with other children. The art therapy sessions that Maxwell had arranged were proving particularly beneficial, providing Emily with healthy outlets for processing her experiences and expressing emotions she still struggled to verbalize. One significant breakthrough came during a family therapy session that Maxwell had initiated to ensure they were building their relationship on solid foundations. Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in adoption and childhood trauma, had been working with them individually and together to address the unique challenges of their situation. During one session in late spring, Emily finally opened up about her memories of the years before the orphanage. "I remember the First Lady, Carmen," Emily said quietly, sitting cross-legged on the comfortable couch in Dr. Chen's office, while Maxwell listened with careful attention. "She was nice to me, and she told me stories about my real daddy who was going to come find me someday. She said the necklace was magic, and it would help him know me when he saw it." Maxwell felt his throat tighten with emotion as he realized that Carmen Reyes had spent years preparing Emily for the reunion that she somehow knew would eventually happen. The woman who had cared for his daughter during her earliest years had understood the significance of the ruby rose pendant and had used it to build Emily's faith in a future that must have seemed impossible, given their circumstances. "Carmen sounds like she loved you very much," Dr. Chen observed, her voice gentle but encouraging. "What else do you remember about living with her?" Emily's expression grew thoughtful as she accessed memories that were clearly precious to her, despite the pain they might contain. "She taught me to read, and she let me help her cook sometimes. She had a little garden behind her house, where she grew tomatoes and flowers. She said gardens needed love and patience to grow, just like little girls." The parallel between Carmen's garden and the garden Maxwell had tended with Sarah was not lost on him, another connection linking his past and present in ways that seemed too meaningful to be coincidental. He made a mental note to create a garden space on the apartment's terrace where he and Emily could grow things together, continuing traditions that honored both Carmen's memory and Sarah's love of growing things. As summer approached, Maxwell made the decision to take Emily on their first extended vacation together, a 2-week trip to a resort in the mountains, where they could focus entirely on each other without the distractions of business and city life. The planning process became an adventure in itself, as Emily helped choose activities and destinations that appealed to her growing sense of curiosity about the world beyond their immediate surroundings. The mountain resort provided the perfect environment for deepening their bond through shared experiences that were entirely removed from Maxwell's corporate identity. They hiked gentle trails through forests, where Emily collected interesting rocks and leaves for art projects. They went horseback riding, with Emily showing surprising natural ability and fearlessness that reminded Maxwell of his own childhood adventures. Evening campfires provided opportunities for storytelling and quiet conversations that revealed more about Emily's personality and dreams than months of shorter interactions had accomplished. One evening, as they sat by the fire roasting marshmallows and watching stars emerge in the clear mountain sky, Emily asked Maxwell about his work and why people called him important. Her question prompted him to explain his business in terms she could understand, describing how he helped create technology that made people's lives easier and more connected. Emily listened with the intense focus she brought to subjects that interested her, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated her growing understanding of the adult world she was gradually becoming part of. "Do you like being important?" Emily asked, her voice serious in the way that indicated she was processing concepts that were significant to her developing worldview. Maxwell considered the question carefully, recognizing that his answer would help shape Emily's understanding of success and priorities. Being successful in business has given me resources to take care of you and help other people, which I like very much. But the most important thing I've ever done is become your daddy. Everything else is just work. Emily smiled at this answer, satisfied that she held the primary place in his priorities that a child needed to feel secure and valued. The conversation continued with questions about Emily's dreams and interests, revealing aspirations that ranged from becoming an artist to maybe working with animals to possibly learning to fly airplanes. Maxwell encouraged every possibility, understanding that his role was to provide opportunities and support, rather than directing her choices according to his own preferences or expectations. The vacation marked a turning point in their relationship, establishing a level of comfort and communication that felt natural and permanent. Emily began calling him Daddy without prompting, a transition that felt organic rather than forced. She started sharing more details about her days at school and her interactions with friends, trusting him with the small dramas and victories that made up her expanding social world. When they returned to the city, Maxwell surprised Emily by revealing the garden space he had created on their apartment's terrace while they were away. Professional landscapers had installed raised beds filled with rich soil, along with child-sized tools and a selection of seeds and young plants that Emily could tend according to her own interests and schedule. The centerpiece was a rosebush variety that produced deep red blooms similar to the pendant she wore, creating a living connection between her necklace and the garden that would be uniquely theirs. Emily's delight with the garden exceeded even Maxwell's optimistic expectations. She threw herself into learning about different plants, reading children's gardening books with the same intensity she brought to art projects, and planning elaborate layouts for flowers and vegetables that would grow according to seasonal schedules she was determined to master. The daily routine of watering, weeding, and observing changes in their plants became a shared ritual that provided consistent opportunities for quiet conversation and mutual learning. As autumn approached, and Emily prepared to start second grade at her new school, Maxwell reflected on the year that had transformed both their lives so completely. The angry, driven executive who had reluctantly visited Sunshine Orphanage 11 months earlier had evolved into someone who understood that true success was measured in bedtime stories. Read, scraped knees, comforted, and small victories celebrated with enthusiasm that would have seemed impossible in his previous life, focused entirely on corporate achievements. Emily had grown from a silent, withdrawn child into a confident little girl who approached new experiences with curiosity rather than fear. Her artistic talents continued to develop under professional instruction, but more importantly, her capacity for trust and affection had expanded to encompass not just Maxwell, but also the growing circle of adults and children who had become part of their extended family. Teachers, neighbors, the doorman in their building, and even some of Maxwell's business associates had been charmed by Emily's combination of intelligence, creativity, and genuine warmth. The anniversary of Sarah's death, which had been Maxwell's most difficult day each year since the accident, took on new meaning with Emily in his life. Instead of visiting Sarah's grave alone with flowers and overwhelming grief, Maxwell brought Emily to meet the sister she had never known, but whose memory had become part of their family story. Emily placed a small bouquet of roses from their garden beside Sarah's headstone, while Maxwell explained how love persisted even after death and how family connections transcended physical presence. "I wish I could have known her," Emily said quietly, studying the engraved dates that marked Sarah's brief life. "But I'm glad she left the necklace so you could find me." Maxwell agreed, understanding for the first time that Sarah's death and Emily's discovery were connected parts of a larger story about loss, healing, and the unexpected ways that families could be restored even after seeming permanently broken. The necklace that had once represented only grief had become a symbol of continuity and hope, proof that love could persist through tragedy and emerge transformed but undiminished. As they walked back to their car through the peaceful cemetery, where Sarah rested among gardens maintained by people who understood the importance of beauty in places associated with loss, Maxwell felt a sense of completion that had been missing from his life for years. He had his daughter back, not the same daughter he had lost, but the daughter he had never known he had gained. The future stretched ahead of them, filled with possibilities that honored the past while embracing new adventures and discoveries they would share together. That evening, as Maxwell tucked Emily into bed and listened to her excited plans for tomorrow's garden activities and next weekend's visit to the Science Museum, he realized that finding her had not just restored his capacity for fatherhood, but had taught him lessons about love, patience, and priorities that had made him a better person in every aspect of his life. The ruby rose pendant that caught the light from her bedside lamp was no longer a mystery or a source of pain, but a bridge between sorrow and joy, between what was lost and what was found, between the man he had been and the father he had become. The millionaire CEO who had built an empire through determination and strategic thinking had discovered that his greatest achievement was not measured in dollars or market share, but in the trust of a little girl who had been waiting her entire life for someone to love her completely and permanently. Emily's presence in his life had rewritten his definition of success and shown him that the most important acquisitions were not crests, businesses, or properties, but relationships that enriched the soul and provided meaning that transcended material accomplishments. As Maxwell turned off Emily's bedroom light and settled into his own routine for the evening, he thought about the charity event that had changed everything and wondered how many other miracles were waiting to be discovered by Baraf. People willing to look beyond their immediate plans and recognize opportunities for love that presented themselves in unexpected packages. The necklace had been the key that unlocked the door to their family, but love had been the force that made their house a home and their legal relationship a true family bond that would last for all the years to come.